Have you ever seen an old wedding photo where the bride's smile seems to hide something else cold, calculating, and dangerous? Hello everyone, welcome back to Sleepy History Tales. Thank you for spending time here tonight. Whether you're watching from Europe, America, or some quiet corner of the world, let me know where you're watching from. Today's story takes us back to the early 20th century, to a woman of many names, Victoria Violet, or perhaps someone else. A charmer, a genius, and someone who seemed to know how to turn love into a deadly instrument. Each of her marriages ended in a funeral. Each wedding photo was a disguised obituary. But in 1907, for the first time, that perfect plan fell apart. One man, Theodore Blackwood, saw behind the mask. And what he discovered sent shivers down the spines of America's elite. Sit down, keep your hands still, because this story, the more you listen, the colder it gets. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, of old paper folded so many times it remembered its own creases. Rebecca moved slowly between stacks of trunks and hat boxes in the Salem house that had belonged to her family for 4 generations. Her grandmother's death had left the place quiet and full of duty, an inheritance of rooms and relics of lives long lived. Among the neat chaos of photographs, letters, and gloves, Rebecca found a leather portfolio, the kind wrapped in tissue and hidden at the bottom of a cedar chest as though someone had wanted it to sleep undisturbed. Inside were studio portraits from the turn of the century, crisp, formal images made when photography still felt like an event. Men in stern, dark suits, families arranged with careful distance between them, brides and debutantes in stiff poses. The faces were practiced for permanence, the kind you held to remember who had once been. But one photograph stopped Rebecca cold. Dated October 1905, and labeled on the back, it was a couple's portrait taken in a Boston studio. The painted backdrop pretended to be an elegant parlor, complete with an ornate chair and gilt details that whispered wealth. He looked to be in his early 30s, a neat mustache hair, combed with care, a dark 3-piece suit, cut to flatter. He sat with the confidence of someone used to being seen, a man comfortable with success. Beside him, the woman was startling dark hair arranged into the fashionable Gibson girl, sweep a dress of heavy, costly fabric, stitched with lace and beadwork jewelry that spoke of real money, a diamond necklace that sat like a promise at her throat, and matching earrings that caught the light. What made Rebecca lift her breath was not the finery, but the expression. Both figures smiled, a rare thing in early portraits, where solemnity was the mark of gravity, and their smiles suggested celebration, perhaps a wedding or an engagement. Yet, the woman's smile carried a dissonance. The man's expression felt warm and easy. Hers felt almost too precise, too practiced, as if shaped by habit or instruction. Her eyes did not share the smile. They held something else, a small, steady shadow that did not belong to the pleasant scene. Rebecca, a graphic designer who restored old photographs for a living, carried the print downstairs to the kitchen under the house's afternoon light. She had an eye for nuance the casual observer missed. Curiosity pulled at her. That small mismatch between mouth and eye nagged at the edges of her attention. She scanned the portrait on her professional grade equipment and watched the image bloom on her monitor. The photograph was a striking original. The studio hand had known his craft, rendering fabric, skin, and jewels with exquisite clarity. Light and shadow modeled the faces so that every crease and thread seemed meaningful. She began to examine the image with the methodical care of someone who had spent years coaxing lost detail back into life. Zooming in, she moved from the tight sweep of the Gibson hair to the glint of the necklace, from the curl of the man's mustache, to the tiny, almost invisible catchlight in the woman's eye. What would you notice first if you were holding this portrait? What would you trust the smile or the look that lived behind it? As Rebecca probed the details, the kitchen around her fell away. The house's history gathered close, patient and expectant. The photograph, once a single keepsake among many, began to feel like an invitation, a question pressed through time asking to be answered. The man's image on Rebecca's screen was crisp and composed, every thread of his dark suit rendered in patient grey. His grooming was immaculate. The neat trim of his mustache, the smooth fall of his hair, even the faint sheen of polished shoes just visible beneath the hem of his trousers. His hands resting lightly on the carved arm of the chair looked soft and unworked. The hand of a thinker, perhaps, or a man whose wealth allowed him to touch only paper, never labor. Banker, lawyer, merchant of influence. He wore his privilege with the easy stillness of someone long accustomed to being watched. The woman beside him, though, commanded the eye. Her gown shimmered under magnification silk embroidered so finely it seemed to breathe. The lace cuffs were hand-tatted, her necklace heavy with diamonds that would have cost a fortune even in that gilded age. It spoke of wealth certainly, or of a suitor determined to buy his way into adoration. Yet as Rebecca zoomed in, beauty gave way to something else. The smile, perfect at first glance, betrayed tiny fractures. The corners of the mouth lifted unevenly, as though shaped by habit, not joy. Her eyes, on closer inspection, didn't quite match the performance below them. Rebecca felt a small chill crawl up her neck as she noticed the woman's right hand. It wasn't resting gracefully as it should have been. Hidden partly behind the man's chair, it was clenched tight knuckles, pale and rigid, like a secret trying not to surface. She increased the contrast. A faint mark appeared on the silk sleeve near that tense fist, a dark, uneven stain, half erased. Not enough to name, but enough to unsettle. Someone had tried to clean it, she realized, but not well enough to hide it from time or technology. Then came the eyes. Rebecca zoomed closer until the pixels almost dissolved. The woman's gaze, once charming, now seemed sharpened. Cold, calculating. There was no warmth there, no affection for the man beside her. Instead, the expression carried a strange dominance, as if she wasn't smiling with him, but at him, studying him, waiting. Rebecca leaned back uneasy. The deeper she looked, the less this appeared to be a keepsake of love, and more an image that had captured something the camera shouldn't have: tension, frozen behind the gloss of social perfection. What secret had this woman been holding? When the shutter clicked in 1905, her curiosity wouldn't let go. The name written on the back, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Whitman, Boston Studio, October 1905, became her next clue. That night she began to dig. Harold Whitman, she learned, was no small man in Boston's early 20th century world. A self-made businessman, he'd risen from modest beginnings through clever trade, importing fine goods from Europe and Asia for America's wealthy. His name filled old ledgers and charity rosters. In newspaper archives, his face appeared often beside the words refined and generous. He attended galas, donated art, and stood in photographs beside politicians and ministers, a model of success and respectability. But his wife? That was another story. The records were thin too thin. Rebecca discovered that Harold had married a woman named Victoria Ashford in September 1905, just weeks before their portrait was taken. There was no sign of her before then. No Boston lineage. No traceable family. It was as if she had simply appeared fully formed, dressed in silk, ready for society. The newspapers of that year called her a charming widow from Philadelphia, a woman who had suffered loss and sought a new beginning. But when Rebecca searched for the supposed first husband, for any trace of an Ashford connected to her name in Philadelphia's marriage or death records, she found nothing. No family, no address, no mention at all. Who was she really? And what, Rebecca wondered, had she done before the camera caught her smiling beside a man who by all accounts should have been the happiest groom in Boston? The silence of the digital screen seemed to deepen as Rebecca stared at the image. That faint stain, that clenched hand, those predatory eyes. Whatever story hid inside that photograph, it had not yet finished telling itself. The more Rebecca read, the colder the air around her seemed to grow. The Boston Herald announcement, yellowed with age, described the wedding of Harold Whitman and Victoria Ashford as a quiet ceremony, attended by only the most intimate of friends. That single line made Rebecca pause. Quiet for a man of Whitman's stature. In Boston's gilded society, weddings like his were spectacles, floral parades of power and reputation, crowded with dignitaries and debutantes. But this one had been discreet, almost secretive, and there was another odd detail. Letters from Harold's friends preserved in scattered archives carried a tone of polite confusion. His business partner wrote to a colleague that autumn, confessing unease, "Harold seems quite bewitched by his new bride, but I find her manner strange. Artificial, perhaps. She asks too many questions about his financial affairs, far too many for a woman of supposed breeding." The words struck Rebecca like an echo from the portrait itself. That too perfect smile, those watchful eyes. The woman in the photograph wasn't just mysterious. She was deliberate. Someone who played a role, practiced it, and wore it like silk. Piece by piece, the illusion began to fray. When Rebecca searched further, she found the thread that pulled everything apart. Harold Whitman, the successful importer, the polished gentleman whose confidence seemed unshakable, had died only 5 months after his marriage. February 1906. Cause of death: sudden heart failure. A vague, convenient phrase in an era when unexplained deaths were rarely questioned. But the newspapers told a subtler story. Whitman had been in perfect health, no sign of heart trouble, no illness. His physician, Dr. Edmund Carey, was quoted as being deeply puzzled by the suddenness of it all. And then came the detail that chilled Rebecca's blood. Just 2 weeks before his death, Harold had changed his will. The new document left everything: his home, his business, holdings, his investments to his new wife, Victoria. Gone were the charitable donations, the small legacies to distant cousins. Every dollar now flowed to her. The witness, a lawyer named Samuel Morrison, a man who, according to Boston's legal records, had no history in the city before that year and vanished immediately after. When Rebecca looked deeper into Morrison's background, she found nothing. No prior cases, no addresses, no trace. Victoria moved quickly. Within a month of Harold's funeral, the Whitman home was sold. Bank accounts were closed. Her jewelry and belongings were packed and removed by hired men. Then, she vanished. No forwarding address, no mention in the society pages. No trace of the radiant bride who had smiled so confidently into the camera. But Rebecca wasn't ready to stop. Something in her, perhaps that same quiet instinct that had drawn her to the photograph, whispered that Victoria Ashford was only one name among many. She began searching beyond Boston. Philadelphia came first. There she found the obituary of a textile manufacturer, Charles Morrison, who had died in 1904, just 6 months after marrying a woman described as a charming widow from Baltimore named Virginia Ashworth. The pattern was unmistakable. Then Chicago, 1903. A banker named Robert Patterson, dead of sudden illness mere months after marrying a Victoria Ashby, a supposed widow from St. Louis. In each story, the details blurred but repeated a wealthy man, a whirlwind romance, a rapid will, change and unexpected death, and a bride who dissolved into thin air, her trail ending at the edge of the obituary column. Different names, different cities, the same haunting script. Rebecca stared at the glow of her computer screen, the 1905 portrait still open beside the search results. The woman's eyes, frozen in silver nitrate a century ago, seemed to look straight through the decades and into her own. Who was she, really? Victoria, Virginia, Victoria again. A widow? A con artist? Or something darker? Still something that moved through cities and lives, shedding names like snakeskin. The house creaked softly around her, the night heavy with the scent of cedar and old dust. Rebecca leaned closer to the image, almost whispering to herself, "What did you do to them?" The screen, of course, offered no answer. Only that same practiced smile, that same gaze that refused to look away. The realization struck Rebecca like a chill that began somewhere deep in her chest and spread outward, slow and paralyzing. She was no longer staring at an eerie coincidence, nor even at a simple historical curiosity. The pattern was too clear, too deliberate. She was looking at the ghost of a killer, not a crime of passion, not a single desperate act, but a deliberate, methodical campaign. A woman who had moved like a shadow across states and years, slipping behind new names and borrowed smiles. A woman who had studied her prey, charmed them, married them, and quietly watched them die. Rebecca sat back from her desk, her pulse fluttering. The photograph of Victoria Ashford or Virginia Ashworth, or Victoria Ashby, or whatever her name truly was, glimmered faintly on the computer screen. That smile now seemed to mock her. She needed to understand how it had been done. At Harvard's medical library under the humming lights and the scent of paper, long undisturbed, Rebecca began searching through medical texts from the early 1900s. Back then, death had been more mysterious, easier to explain away. Forensic science was young and uncertain. Chemical analysis, a privilege reserved for only the most scandalous of cases. She read about poisons once sold openly in apothecaries, powders and tinctures kept in ordinary homes, hidden among the tonics and medicines. Arsenic appeared again and again, a killer that wore many masks. It was sold in rat poison, in dyes, even in certain soaps. Taken slowly in measured doses, it mimicked life itself. Fatigue, stomach pain, a slow, quiet collapse of the heart. Exactly the story told by Harold Whitman's death certificate. Then there was digitalis, a medicine drawn from the foxglove plant, gentle in moderation, deadly in excess. A misplaced drop could stop a heart as neatly as turning a key, and chloroform, common among anesthetics, could still the breath long enough for poison to finish its work. Rebecca felt her throat tighten as she read. How easily it could have been done. How the illusion of tenderness, a wife offering medicine to a weary husband, could conceal so much calculation. In that age, no one would have suspected her. Doctors rarely performed autopsies on respectable citizens. Police were hesitant to accuse a well-dressed widow of foul play. Women of society were seen as gentle, moral, incapable of cruelty. And so, she would have moved freely protected by the very world she deceived. Rebecca found a 1906 article from a medical journal describing the difficulty of detecting arsenic in cases of sudden heart failure. The writer had lamented that only a handful of laboratories in the country possessed the equipment to test for such toxins. For most deaths, trust and ignorance were all that stood between murder and mystery. But Victoria, whoever she truly was, had gone further than Rebecca expected. Among archived manuals from the turn of the century, Rebecca discovered that household guides often included recipes and remedies listing plants and compounds, their uses, dosages, even warnings in fine print about poisonous effects. Any educated woman could have read them. Any clever woman could have used them. Rebecca felt a strange mix of horror and admiration. This woman had not only learned how to kill, she had built an empire of deception around it. Through genealogical databases, Rebecca began tracing the names. Victoria Ashford of Boston, Virginia Ashworth of Philadelphia, Victoria Ashby of Chicago, and others that flickered like ghosts through time. Vera Ashton, Vivian, Ainsworth, each attached to a man of means, each ending the same way. The more Rebecca uncovered, the clearer the pattern became, each new identity meticulously crafted with false papers. Forged marriage certificates, even fabricated letters from friends who had never existed. At the National Archives in Washington, she found confirmation, a fragile envelope of copies from early investigative files and notarized documents. The handwriting matched across several aliases. The signatures differed just enough to fool a casual eye, but not hers. Whoever this woman had been, she was not merely a killer. She was an artist of reinvention. Patient, intelligent, precise. Rebecca sat beneath the quiet hum of the archive lamps, staring at the delicate strokes of ink that had once convinced banks, lawyers, and ministers. Somewhere in the stillness, she thought she could almost hear a whisper, a silken voice from another century saying, "Thank you for being noticed again." The thought sent a tremor through her hands. This was not simply history anymore. It was a presence, something that had survived in paper, in portrait, and in the silence between them. And for the first time, Rebecca wondered if by searching too deeply, she might have awakened it. The sophistication of the forgeries told Rebecca something chilling. Victoria was no ordinary criminal. Each document bore the mark of practiced precision, as if forged by someone who understood both the science and psychology of deception. Marriage licenses, death certificates, elegant handwritten letters from imaginary relatives, all crafted with such convincing detail that even a trained official of the era might never question them. Rebecca began to suspect that Victoria wasn't working alone. Somewhere behind her charm and calculated movements, there might have been a web of accomplices forgers, lawyers, and perhaps men who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. Her suspicion was confirmed when she unearthed a police report from New York City, dated 1907. It mentioned the arrest of a skilled forger named Samuel Morrison, the very same name as the lawyer who had conveniently witnessed Harold Whitman's sudden will change before his death. The report described Morrison's suspected ties to a sophisticated criminal network that specialized in creating false identities for clients who wished to start over, usually after committing fraud, theft, or worse. But Morrison had been released after key witnesses failed to appear. Rebecca sat back, letting the implications settle like dust in a forgotten archive. This wasn't the story of a lone murderess preying on wealthy men. It was the outline of something far larger, a coordinated operation where greed, charm, and calculated violence worked together like parts of a well-oiled machine. This network, she discovered, thrived in the great cities of the East, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, where fortunes changed hands quickly and new faces were easily accepted without scrutiny. There, Victoria had become the organization's most valuable specialist. Her skill wasn't in brute force but persuasion, in earning the trust and affection of wealthy, isolated men, only to strip their lives away quietly, both figuratively and literally. And she was good at it. Chillingly good. Rebecca's search through estate ledgers and obituaries revealed a disturbing pattern. Each of Victoria's victims had been men of means, often widowers or bachelors, their closest kin, long dead or living far away. Their deaths had been attributed to sudden illness. Their wealth swiftly transferred to their new, grieving wives, who vanished shortly afterward. The more Rebecca pieced together, the more horrifying the picture became. These weren't crimes of passion. They were transactions. Victoria's crimes were part of a business model, one that turned love marriage and trust into currency. And the network behind her had made sure no trace was left behind. But a trail didn't end in Boston. When Rebecca followed her movements through the newspaper archives, she found that after Harold Whitman's death in 1906, Victoria had reappeared elsewhere under a new name, Violet Ashland, amid the glittering social circles of New York City. There, among chandeliers and champagne, she was reborn. The society columns of 1907 painted her as a graceful widow of quiet wealth and untraceable lineage, a woman who captivated everyone she met. Rebecca read the words slowly, the way one might read a eulogy. The charming Mrs. Violet Ashland, radiant as ever, attended last night's charity gala at the Waldorf Astoria. She is said to be among New York's most eligible women of refined sensibility and fortune. It was all there. The same rhythm of deception repeating itself, just dressed in finer silk. And then came the headline that froze Rebecca in her chair. Engagement announced, Mrs. Violet Ashland to wed Mr. Theodore Blackwood. Dated March 15, 1907. Blackwood, a widower 45 years old, heir to a vast railroad fortune. Kind, generous, known for his philanthropy. But since the death of his wife in 1904, he had withdrawn from public life, avoiding the glittering world of New York's elite. Until now, his friends had been surprised, even uneasy about his sudden engagement to a woman he had known for barely a season. And Rebecca knew what they could not have guessed at the time, that this was no love story. It was a pattern, a repetition, a death sentence written in lace and perfume. She stared at the newspaper, clipping her fingers, trembling slightly. Had anyone ever realized what was about to happen? Had anyone ever wondered how many times she had done this before, and how many more would follow? Rebecca closed her notebook. Somewhere out there beneath the bright lights of 1907 New York, Violet Ashland, or whatever name she was using next, was smiling at her next victim. And this time, Rebecca vowed she would not disappear unnoticed. The engagement announcement, that elegant little notice in the New York Herald, had been published only days before that haunting 1905 photograph of Victoria and Harold Whitman had been taken. To Rebecca, that realization felt like a blade twisting slowly. It meant that even as Victoria stood smiling beside Harold's doomed body, she had already begun weaving the next web. Her next victim had a name now: Theodore Blackwood. The pattern was unmistakable seduction marriage, a convenient change of will, and then death by natural causes. Each step choreographed like a cruel dance one that Victoria had perfected across years and cities. Rebecca could almost see her now, moving gracefully through ballrooms and soirees, whispering her practiced laughter, studying her next husband with that same polite, unhurried gaze. How many men had fallen under it before realizing too late? But this time, something had gone wrong. When Rebecca turned to the marriage records, she noticed something strange. The license for Violet Ashland and Theodore Blackwood had been obtained, yes, but never filed. The ceremony had never taken place. And in that absence, buried in ink and paper, Rebecca found the first sign that Victoria's perfect system had begun to crack. The answer came from an unlikely place, a folder of personal letters preserved in the Blackwood family archives at Columbia University. Theodore's correspondence was elegant and restrained, but between the lines, Rebecca could feel the growing dread of a man who was beginning to glimpse the truth. In a letter dated March 30th, 1907, Blackwood wrote to his cousin, "I have made some inquiries about Violet's past in Philadelphia, where she says she resided, and I must confess, I am troubled. No one seems to have known her or her late husband. The church she claims married them has no such record." Somewhere between politeness and panic, he had begun to see the outline of something monstrous. He had quietly hired a private investigator, Patrick Sullivan, a retired police detective, to look into Violet's history. Sullivan's report, tucked among the papers, sent a cold shiver through Rebecca as she read it. The woman known as Violet Ashland has appeared under various names in several cities. Each time a wealthy man of standing has died under peculiar circumstances shortly after contact with her. While I cannot provide direct proof, I must warn Mr. Blackwood that he may be in grave danger. Then came Theodore's final letter, dated April 3rd, 1907, written in the unsteady hand of a man who had just looked into the eyes of the truth. I confronted Violet yesterday about the inconsistencies in her story. Her demeanor changed entirely. The grace and tenderness that first drew me to her vanished, replaced by a cold fury I cannot describe. She denied everything and left my home at once. I have not seen her since. I intend to go to the police. Rebecca felt her breath catch as she turned the final page. The words were ordinary, yet they vibrated with the terror of a man who had realized too late that he had been living beside a predator. A police report dated April 5th, 1907 confirmed what came next. Theodore Blackwood had formally filed a complaint naming Violet Ashland as a suspect in multiple suspicious deaths. Detective Sullivan had supported his claims with documented cases from Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago threads, all leading back to one woman with 100 faces. But when officers arrived to question her, she was already gone. Her apartment emptied overnight. Her bank accounts closed. Her servants dismissed without explanation. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume and the echo of her false laughter. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, letting the enormity of it settle in. For the first time, Victoria had been forced to flee, her careful illusion shattered by suspicion. The elegant mask had cracked, revealing the cold machinery beneath. But even now, one question refused to leave Rebecca's mind. If Victoria could plan so far ahead, could disappear so completely, where did she go next? And more chilling still, who was she planning to become? That photograph, the one Rebecca had stared at for nights on end, had now become something far darker than a curiosity. It was a window into a woman who had once walked freely among the powerful, smiling as she plotted death. Theodore Blackwood had been the turning point, the first time one of her chosen victims had seen through the illusion. His report to the police had rippled outward quietly, awakening something new in American law enforcement cooperation. For the first time, detectives from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago began to share information, tracing one woman's footsteps across the map. In the spring of 1907, a task force was born. At its head stood Inspector James McCarthy, a man known for his unusual methods and his refusal to bow to wealth or influence. His files, now yellowed and brittle in the New York archives, revealed the slow, methodical unraveling of Victoria's secrets. He had ordered the impossible for that time: exhumations, graves reopened, tissues tested. Beneath polite marble markers and angel statues, the truth was waiting arsenic in deadly deliberate doses. Harold Whitman, Charles Morrison, Robert Patterson, the poisoner's signature. McCarthy followed the money next. His notes mapped a shadowy web of bank accounts and aliases, all leading to the same quiet fortune, over $200,000, an empire, built on deception and death. And then, the discovery that froze Rebecca's blood. Through one of the earliest uses of fingerprint analysis, McCarthy's team identified the woman calling herself Victoria Ashford Virginia Ashworth Violet Ashland as someone entirely different. Her real name was Margaret Whitmore, born to a modest family in Cleveland. No socialite, no widow. A grifter who had spent her youth in small cons and forgeries before learning something far more profitable. By the winter of 1907, her name, or rather the many names she'd worn, had been whispered to police in 6 states. Notices were sent to banks, hotels, private clubs, anywhere she might surface again. For the first time, Margaret was being hunted. Rebecca's research reached its eerie climax when she uncovered a sealed folder untouched for decades, the final chapter of the case. The file told of San Francisco, early 1908. There, under the name Vivian Ashton, she had re-emerged, poised to marry a wealthy mining heir named William Preston. But this time, her web had tangled. Her old associate, Samuel Morrison, the forger who had once stood beside her in Boston, had been arrested in a federal counterfeiting sting. Facing ruin, he turned informant. His confession described Margaret's methods in chilling detail. Her disguises, her poisons, her victims. Armed with this testimony, federal agents and San Francisco police began to close in. They planned to catch her in the act to finally end the years of quiet killing. But before they could knock on her door, she was dead. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read the coroner's report. Vivian Ashton found deceased in her hotel suite February 14, 1908. Cause of death, strychnine poisoning. There had been no struggle, no note. The poison had been fast and agonizing, the very same method she had used on others. Suicide. Or had the hunter finally been hunted? The whispers within the files suggested the latter, that her own criminal network, desperate to protect themselves, had silenced her. She had become too visible, too dangerous. The woman who once orchestrated death had become its final instrument. Inspector McCarthy's last report closed the file with a single grim line. Justice was done, though not by our hands. Rebecca sat for a long time, staring at that faded photograph once more. Victoria or Margaret or Vivian, the name hardly mattered now. Behind that poised expression and polished beauty, she could see the glint of calculation, the mask of charm concealing a predatory hunger. The story was finally complete, but peace did not follow. Because what lingered most was the realization that evil, when it learns to smile, can move among us unnoticed for years, perhaps forever. Rebecca donated her findings to the Massachusetts Historical Society. The archives accepted them quietly, labeling the case resolved. But as she placed the photograph back into its folder, Rebecca whispered softly, almost as if to the woman in the picture herself, resolved, but never forgotten. And if you were to look at that same photograph today in the quiet of a museum or a late-night documentary, would you still see beauty? Or would you, like Rebecca, see something moving beneath the smile? Something that never truly died in that San Francisco hotel room?